Japanese immigrants played a significant role in the economies of Brazil and Peru.
And sometimes when groups play significant roles, it makes other people dislike them, as we'll see was the case with the Japanese immigrants. And so to see how this occurred, let's continue reading in the book right here, Wealth, Poverty, and Politics by Dr. Thomas Sowell, and see if we can get some understanding.
Although the Japanese were only 2 to 3% of the population in Brazil's state of São Paulo and owned less than 2% of its land, they produced nearly 30% of the state's agricultural output in the early 1930s, including 46% of the cotton, 57% of the silk, and 75% of the tea. A substantial proportion of the bananas plantations were also in Japanese hands.
They may have been small in their size, but they were large in their output, showing us once again that huge numbers are not necessary. And this is especially true when you surround yourself with the right type of people who have the same values and they have the same standards and goals, right? Let's keep it going.
Peru was another Latin American nation in which a small number of Japanese immigrants played a disproportionate role in the economy. Beginning in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as agricultural laborers, working under conditions that led to high death rates, the Japanese in Peru soon moved into urban communities, where they began working in occupations ranging from domestic servants to small business owners.
They started making their move from being worked to death to being domestic servants and then to owning small businesses. And so what this reminds me of is how the Japanese became established in the United States. And so they initially came here as agricultural laborers, and then they eventually worked themselves out of that generation by generation. And so it's a most marvelous thing to see people accomplish this type of stuff.
Eventually, the Japanese owned 3/4 of all the barbershops and 200 grocery stores in Peru's capital city, Lima. Even as agricultural laborers, the Japanese work habits made them more in demand than Peruvian workers, and the Japanese laborers were paid more.
Here's one of the areas that set the Japanese apart from the Peruvians. They worked harder, and more precisely, they worked harder in specific areas, and because of that, they were in more demand, as we should expect, right? So you tell me, if you were an employer and you had the choice to hire someone who's gonna work hard versus someone who's gonna like lollygag around and drag their feet, which one would you choose?
The Japanese acquired a reputation not only for hard work, but also for reliability and honesty.
And on top of working hard, they showed up to work on time and were honest, right? They had a winning formula. And who could possibly be mad at that? You would think that no one would, but that's not the case, as we'll see later on.
They also took more interest than Peruvians in the education of their children.
The Japanese were investing more in the education of their upcoming generation. And when you think about it, and when you remember, this is the same thing that the Fujianese from China did, right? When they came to New York, the Jews did the same thing when they arrived. Who else did? The Nigerians. This is what they're doing right now, right? The Cubans, they did the same thing when they came over into Florida. And what these people understood is that education was something that was not to be taken lightly, right? And you have to invest in this area. And even more so today, right? We live today in the information age. And so going further, the groups that don't become educated and are not culturally prepared, these are going to be the people of the pit, right? That's just the bottom line, and that's just the way it goes.
Manufacturing firms in Peru during this era were usually controlled either by foreigners or by recent immigrants,
because they were the people that were more qualified. But instead of the Peruvians becoming more qualified and developing more skills, this is what the Peruvians did instead.
Like other minority groups who have been more successful than members of the majority population in other times and places, the Japanese were resented in Peru.
They started hating on them, right? Crying and complaining. People, they get mad when they see themselves getting outperformed by others, because what it does is it shines a light on them, and many times it reveals something about them that they may not have wanted to see, right? And on a subconscious level, it communicates that they may have to make some sacrifices in order to compete with these winning groups, which ultimately means that they have to replace some of the things that they're doing with other things. And for some people, that may mean having to cut out many of the unproductive leisure activities and replace it with developing a skill, right? And many people, they don't like that idea of doing such things. And so it creates tension and frustration within themselves. And then it manifests as resentment, as was the case that we're seeing right here.
These resentments were expressed in editorial criticisms and in boycotts of Japanese-owned businesses. though these boycotts failed because the Japanese usually charged lower prices than others. However, political measures against the Japanese were more effective.
Now watch what they did here.
These included a law requiring at least 80% of all employees to be Peruvians, and immigration from Japan was severely restricted in the mid-1930s.
This is a group that the government feels like they need to treat them like children and give them handouts. But what's more beneficial to the society is not having government provide preferential treatment for certain groups, and instead just letting people hire those people who are best qualified for the jobs. And so you can imagine if one of your friends or family members needed to have heart surgery, would you rather the surgeon be someone who was hired because they were the most qualified, or someone that was hired because the people had to fill some type of quota? We all know which one we would pick. And so it benefits the society to have the best qualified people do the jobs that they're most qualified to do, right? And so if a person or a group, they can't compete in certain areas, then they either need to train harder or they need to find something else to do.
Disdain for commerce and industry at the higher social levels of Hispanic and Portuguese societies, whether in Europe or among their Western Hemisphere offshoots, has been paralleled by an aversion to manual labor and hard work at the lower social levels. What has been involved in such attitudes has not been simple laziness, but what a scholar writing about 17th century Spain characterized as pride and indolence, reflecting an aversion to the stigma associated with manual work in that culture.
They thought they were above and beyond doing manual work, which the Japanese immigrants, they didn't think so, right? And so this type of attitude, it makes it easier to see how people like the Japanese immigrants were able to come to that land and then outperform those people.
Centuries later, Paraguayans were bewildered by the unrelenting work of people in Japanese agricultural colonies in their country, and Honduran farmers complained that it was unfair for them to have to compete with the German farmers in their country, since the latter were considered to be working too hard.
Here goes the crying and complaining, right? The people are working way too hard. Tell these people to slow down because we don't feel like working that hard. Can you see that?
Latin America has by no means been unique on the world stage in not simply failing to reach the standards of productivity set by others, but in positively rejecting, resenting, and restricting those who are more productive, and explaining away their own lags by blaming exploitation by others at home and abroad.
Understand that one of the most powerful things that you can do is learn to minimize the blaming of others and maximize the amount of responsibility that you take for your situation and circumstance. And so when you do this, what it does is it keeps the power in your own hands. And that's the power that you're going to need to latch onto the ladder, to climb rung by rung out of the pit and enter into the free world where life is much better and it makes more sense. And so this here is the end of part 6 commentary on the book here, Wealth, Poverty, and Politics by Dr. Thomas Sowell. And I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. I appreciate it. And so my name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.